Welcome back to another night here together. Tonight, we're diving deep into encounters that happened far from city lights, in places where the veil between our world and something else seems thinner. These are the stories that keep people awake long after they should be sleeping, wondering what else might be watching from the darkness. I want you to settle in, get comfortable, and let these experiences wash over you. Whether you're a believer or a skeptic, these accounts come from ordinary people who found themselves face to face with the extraordinary. So dim the lights, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin. It was 3 a.m. when Sarah first noticed her bedroom felt different. Not cold exactly, but charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. She'd been having trouble sleeping for weeks, tossing and turning in her small apartment on the outskirts of Portland. The stress from her new job at the accounting firm was wearing her down, and her doctor had suggested she try meditation before bed. That's what she was doing when it happened. Lying on her back, eyes closed, focusing on her breathing. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. The technique was actually working. Her muscles were relaxing, her mind quieting. She felt herself drifting toward that peaceful space between waking and sleep. Then the humming started. It was so low at first that she wasn't sure if she was hearing it or feeling it. A vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah opened her eyes and sat up, scanning her small bedroom. The digital clock on her nightstand read 3:07 a.m. The sound was definitely real, definitely coming from somewhere outside her apartment. She slipped out of bed and padded to the window, pulling back the thin curtain. The parking lot below was empty, except for the usual cars. No maintenance trucks, no early morning deliveries. But the humming was getting louder now, more distinct. It had a rhythm to it, almost musical, but unlike anything she'd ever heard before. Sarah pressed her face to the glass, trying to locate the source. That's when she saw them. 3 lights hung motionless above the apartment complex across the street. Not aircraft lights, not drones. These were different. They pulsed in unison, a soft blue-white that seemed to breathe. Each one was roughly the size of a car, perfectly spherical, and they maintained their formation with mechanical precision. Her first thought was to grab her phone and record this, but when she reached for it on the nightstand, her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The screen wouldn't respond to her touch. It wasn't frozen exactly, more like it was being interfered with. The display flickered between her home screen and static. When she looked back out the window, one of the objects had moved closer. It now hovered directly across from her building, maybe 50 feet away. Close enough that she could see it wasn't solid in the way normal things are solid. The surface seemed to shift and ripple, like looking at something underwater. The humming had evolved into something more complex now, layers of sound that rose and fell in patterns. Sarah found herself listening intently, trying to decode what felt like a message. Her analytical mind, the one that spent all day organizing numbers and data, was desperately trying to find logic in what she was experiencing. But there was something else happening too. As she watched the nearest object, she began to feel a strange calmness settling over her. The fear and confusion didn't disappear exactly, but they seemed less important somehow, like she was viewing them from a distance. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat steadied, and she felt an overwhelming sense of being observed, but not threatened. Minutes passed, though she couldn't say how many. Time felt elastic, unreliable. The 3 objects maintained their formation, pulsing in that synchronized rhythm. Then, without any change in their behavior, without any warning, they simply weren't there anymore. Not faded, not moved away, just gone, as if they had never existed. The silence that followed was profound. No humming, no electrical interference. Even the usual city sounds seemed muted. Sarah stood at her window for another hour, watching and waiting, but nothing else happened. Her phone worked normally again. The parking lot remained empty. The world had returned to its familiar, ordinary state. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She sat in her kitchen, drinking tea, and trying to make sense of what she'd witnessed. By morning, she'd almost convinced herself it had been a dream, or stress-induced hallucination, or some kind of atmospheric phenomenon she didn't understand. But 3 days later, she found the mark. It was on her arm, just above her left elbow, a small, perfectly circular discoloration about the size of a dime. Not a bruise exactly, and not a burn. The skin wasn't raised or irritated. It was simply a different color, a faint silver that seemed to shimmer when she moved her arm in certain light. Sarah made an appointment with her doctor, but the mark didn't show up clearly in photographs. Under the office's fluorescent lighting, it was barely visible. Her doctor suggested it might be a mild allergic reaction or a birthmark she'd never noticed before. But Sarah knew better. She'd had the same body for 26 years, and this mark was new. Over the following weeks, she found herself paying attention to things she'd never noticed before. The way certain electronic devices would glitch when she was around. How her dreams had become unusually vivid and often featured vast, open spaces under unfamiliar skies. The feeling, growing stronger each day, that she was being watched by something patient and interested. She started researching online, reading forums and websites about unexplained phenomena. The stories she found were remarkably similar to her own. People describing lights that moved with impossible precision, periods of missing time, and small marks that appeared without explanation. Many of them reported the same sense of being monitored, of being part of something larger than themselves. One evening, about a month after her first sighting, Sarah was walking home from work when she felt that familiar charge in the air. She looked up and saw a single light hovering high above the city. It was too far away to make out details, but she knew with absolute certainty that it was the same type of object she'd seen from her window. This time, she didn't feel afraid. Instead, she felt something like recognition, as if she was seeing an old friend after a long absence. The light pulsed once, twice, then vanished. But Sarah was left with a distinct impression that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. She never saw the objects again, at least not directly, but the mark on her arm remained, and with it, a quiet awareness that the world was far stranger and more interconnected than she'd ever imagined. Sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, she would stand at her window and wonder if they were still out there, watching and waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, she thought she could still hear that humming, faint and distant, like a song being played in another room. Dr. Michael Chen had been studying atmospheric phenomena for 15 years when he encountered something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. It was during a routine research expedition in northern Alaska, where his team was investigating unusual aurora activity that had been reported by local pilots and weather stations. The expedition was supposed to last 2 weeks. They'd set up their equipment in a remote location about 60 miles from the nearest settlement, a collection of sensitive instruments designed to measure electromagnetic fluctuations and atmospheric disturbances. Michael had done this kind of work dozens of times before. It was methodical, predictable science. On the 4th night, the aurora appeared right on schedule. But what they saw wasn't like any natural light display Michael had ever witnessed. The colors were wrong, for one thing. Instead of the usual greens and blues, these lights shifted through spectrum of colors that seemed almost artificial. Deep purples, brilliant golds, and a shade of red that was so intense it made his eyes water. But it wasn't just the colors that bothered him. It was the way the lights moved. Aurora typically flow and dance in patterns that follow the Earth's magnetic field lines. These lights moved with purpose, forming geometric shapes that held their configuration for minutes at a time before dissolving and reforming into new patterns. Michael's colleague, Dr. Sarah Williams, was the first to notice that their instruments were picking up readings that didn't match what they were seeing. The electromagnetic sensors showed massive disturbances, but they were coming from a different direction than the lights. It was as if there were two separate phenomena occurring simultaneously. "Michael, you need to see this," Sarah called from the instrument cluster. Her voice had a tension he'd rarely heard from her. Sarah was unflappable, the kind of scientist who stayed calm during equipment failures and unexpected weather. But now she sounded genuinely unsettled. The magnetometer was showing fluctuations unlike anything in the literature. The needle wasn't just moving, it was oscillating in patterns that seemed to correspond with the geometric shapes in the sky. But more disturbing was the infrared detector, which was picking up heat signatures at ground level, moving through the surrounding landscape. "Are those animals?" Michael asked, studying the display. "I don't think so," Sarah replied. "Look at the pattern of movement, and the heat signature is all wrong. Too uniform, too sustained." They watched the infrared display for several minutes. The signatures moved in straight lines, paused for precise intervals, then changed direction at perfect angles. No biological creature moved like that, but the alternatives were even more unsettling. Over the next hour, the light display above them intensified. The geometric patterns became more complex, almost like a language being written across the sky. Meanwhile, the heat signatures on the ground seemed to be conducting some kind of systematic survey of the area around their camp. Michael made the decision to investigate. Against Sarah's objections, he suited up in cold weather gear and left the relative safety of their heated shelter. The temperature was 20 below zero, and the wind was picking up, but he needed to see what was out there. The landscape around their camp was typical Arctic terrain: rolling hills covered in snow, scattered outcroppings of rock, and the occasional stunted tree. Under normal circumstances, visibility would have been limited to a few hundred yards, but the lights overhead were so bright they illuminated the ground like daylight. Michael followed the compass bearing that corresponded to the nearest heat signature. As he walked, he became aware of a sound, or maybe a vibration, that seemed to come from beneath his feet. It was rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, but far too slow and deep to be biological. After about 10 minutes of walking, he found them. They weren't animals, and they weren't human. 3 figures stood motionless in a small clearing, arranged in a perfect triangle. They were tall, maybe 7 feet, with proportions that were almost human, but somehow wrong. Their limbs were too long, their heads too large. They wore no visible clothing, but their skin, if it was skin, seemed to absorb and reflect the aurora light in impossible ways. Michael stopped about 30 yards away, his scientific mind racing to process what he was seeing. The figures didn't acknowledge his presence, didn't turn to look at him. They simply stood there, as still as statues, while the lights above them pulsed and shifted. He tried to move closer, but found that his legs wouldn't obey him. Not paralyzed exactly, but as if his body had decided, without consulting his conscious mind, that this was close enough. He stood there for what felt like hours, though his watch later showed it had been only minutes, observing and being observed. The figures weren't entirely motionless, he realized. They were breathing, or something like breathing. Their bodies rose and fell in a rhythm that matched the vibration he felt through the ground. And there was something else, a sense of communication happening that didn't involve sound or movement, ideas and impressions that seemed to arrive directly in his mind. They were studying the planet, he somehow understood. Not just the atmosphere or the magnetic field, but something deeper. The way life interacted with the environment, the way consciousness emerged from matter, the way intelligence developed and spread. They had been doing this for a very long time, far longer than human civilization had existed. Michael was not the first human they had encountered, but he was among the few who had seen them directly. Most of their work was done from a distance, unobserved and undetected, but occasionally, when conditions were right,
and when they encountered someone with the proper combination of knowledge and openness, they allowed themselves to be seen. The experience was not threatening, but it was overwhelming. Michael felt his understanding of reality expanding and contracting like an accordion. Everything he thought he knew about physics, about life, about humanity's place in the universe, was being gently but firmly revised. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the encounter was over. The figures simply faded away, not walking or flying, but dissolving like mist. The aurora above returned to more normal colors and patterns. The vibration beneath his feet stopped. Michael found himself alone in the Arctic night, with only his rapidly cooling breath as evidence that he hadn't imagined the entire experience. When he returned to camp, Sarah was frantic. According to her instruments, he had been gone for over 3 hours, but according to Michael's watch and his own sense of time, it had been maybe 20 minutes. The discrepancy was impossible to reconcile.
They packed up their equipment the next morning and returned to civilization 2 days early. Michael never published a paper about what they had recorded that night. The data was too anomalous, too far outside the accepted parameters of atmospheric science. It would have destroyed his career. But he kept the recordings, and he continued to study them. Late at night, in his office at the university, he would play back the electromagnetic readings and remember the sensation of standing in that clearing, feeling his understanding of the universe expand beyond anything he had thought possible. Sometimes, on clear nights, when the aurora was particularly active, Michael would drive out to dark locations away from the city and watch the sky. He never saw the geometric patterns again, never felt that peculiar vibration through the ground, but he remained convinced that they were still out there, still studying, still learning, and sometimes, just for a moment, he thought he could sense them watching him back. The old farmhouse had been in Elena's family for 3 generations, sitting on 40 acres of rolling hills in central Virginia. She'd inherited it from her grandmother 2 years ago, along with the accompanying stories about strange lights that would appear over the back pasture. Elena had always assumed these were just family folklore, the kind of tales that accumulate around old places like dust. She was wrong. Eleanor worked as a freelance graphic designer, which meant she could live anywhere with decent internet. The farmhouse was perfect for her needs, quiet, affordable, and far enough from the city to provide the kind of peace she craved after years of urban living. She'd spent months renovating the place, updating the plumbing and electrical, while trying to preserve its rustic character. The first incident happened on a Tuesday night in late September. Elena was working late in what used to be the front parlor, now converted into her office. She had a deadline approaching for a major client, and she'd been pushing herself to finish the project. It was nearly midnight when she noticed the quality of light outside had changed. At first, she thought it was just her tired eyes playing tricks on her. But when she looked up from her computer screen, she could see that the pasture behind the house was illuminated by a soft, blue-white glow. Not moonlight. This was something else entirely. The light seemed to come from above, but when she looked out the window, she couldn't see any source. Elena grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the back porch. The September air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and damp earth. The glow was definitely real, and it was moving slowly across the pasture in a pattern that seemed almost methodical, like someone conducting a search. She walked down into the yard to get a better view. The light was coming from something hovering about 50 feet above the ground, something large and silent that moved with fluid precision. Elena couldn't make out its shape clearly. The light it emitted was too bright and diffuse, but she could see that it wasn't any kind of aircraft she was familiar with. As she watched, the object paused directly over a section of the pasture where her grandmother used to keep cattle. The light intensified, and Elena could swear she heard a faint humming sound, like the noise a fluorescent bulb makes when it's about to burn out. The grass beneath the object seemed to wave gently, as if moved by an unfelt breeze. Then, without warning, the light shut off. Eleanor was left standing in her backyard, temporarily blinded by the sudden darkness. When her eyes adjusted, she could see nothing unusual. No object, no glow, no evidence that anything had been there at all. She went back inside and tried to return to her work, but concentration was impossible. Elena kept looking out the window, half expecting the light to return. When it didn't, she eventually gave up and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, she walked out to the section of pasture where the object had hovered. The grass there was different, not burned or damaged, but somehow changed. It was a slightly different shade of green, more vibrant than the surrounding area, and when she knelt down to examine it more closely, she noticed that it was warm to the touch, despite the cool morning air. Elena took photos of the area and measurements of the affected zone. It was a perfect circle, about 30 feet in diameter. She sent the pictures to her cousin David, who worked as a botanist at Virginia Tech. His response was immediate and puzzled. He'd never seen anything like it, and he wanted to come out and take soil samples. But when David arrived 3 days later, the circle was gone. The grass had returned to its normal color and temperature. There was no evidence that anything unusual had ever happened there. David was polite, but clearly skeptical of Elena's story. She couldn't blame him. If someone had told her the same thing a week earlier, she would have been skeptical too. The lights returned the following Tuesday, at almost exactly the same time. Elena was ready for them this time. She had her camera set up by the window, and she managed to capture several minutes of footage before the object disappeared again. When she reviewed the video the next day, however, she was disappointed to find that the camera had recorded nothing but ordinary darkness. This pattern continued for several weeks. Every Tuesday night, around midnight, the lights would appear over the pasture. Elena began to look forward to these visits, despite their mysterious nature. There was something almost comforting about their regularity, their peaceful presence. She started staying up late on Tuesday nights, watching from her window and trying to understand what she was witnessing. On the 6th Tuesday, something different happened. Instead of hovering over the pasture, the object descended and landed. Elena watched in amazement as a section of what she had thought was solid light opened up, revealing a darker interior. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the glow. The figure was humanoid, but wrong in ways that Elena couldn't quite articulate. Too tall, too thin, with movements that were fluid, yet somehow mechanical. It walked slowly around the landing site, occasionally bending down to examine something on the ground. After about 10 minutes, it returned to the object, which sealed itself and lifted off silently into the night sky. Elena didn't sleep at all that night. She sat in her kitchen, drinking coffee and trying to process what she had seen. By morning, she had made a decision. The next Tuesday, she would try to make contact. When the following Tuesday arrived, Eleanor was waiting in the pasture. She'd been there since 11:30, sitting on a folding chair she'd brought from the house. She felt nervous, but determined. Whatever these visitors were, they had been coming to her family's land for decades. Her grandmother had seen them, and probably her great-grandmother before that. It was time to acknowledge their presence. The object appeared right on schedule, descending from the star-filled sky with its familiar silent grace. This time, however, it landed much closer to where Elena was sitting. The glow it emitted was warm and somehow welcoming. As before, a section of the craft opened, and the tall figure emerged. For a moment, Eleanor and the visitor simply looked at each other across the moonlit pasture. Then, slowly and carefully, Eleanor stood up and took a step forward. The figure tilted its head in what might have been acknowledgement and took a step toward her. They met in the middle of the field, two beings from different worlds sharing a moment of mutual curiosity. The visitor was even stranger up close than Elena had imagined. Its skin had a translucent quality, and its eyes were large and dark, reflecting the starlight like pools of water. When it spoke, Elena heard the words, not with her ears, but directly in her mind. "We have been watching your kind for a very long time," it said, its mental voice gentle and somehow tinged with sadness. "We are scientists, like some of your people. We study the development of consciousness, the way awareness emerges from matter and grows into something greater." Eleanor found that she could respond in the same way, thinking her words rather than speaking them. "Why here? Why my family's land?" "This place has good energy," came the reply. "The soil, the water, the life that grows here. It has remained relatively pure, undamaged by your industrial processes. We use it as a reference point to measure how your world is changing." They communicated for what felt like hours, though Elena later realized it could have been only minutes. The visitor told her about their world, a place where consciousness had evolved beyond the need for individual bodies, where science and spirituality were not separate disciplines, but aspects of the same quest for understanding. In return, Elena shared her own perspective on humanity, its struggles and achievements, its hopes and fears. The visitor listened with what seemed like genuine interest and compassion. When their conversation finally ended, Eleanor felt as though she had made a friend across the vast distances of space and time. "Will you come back?" she asked, as the visitor prepared to leave. "We are always here," it replied, "but whether you see us depends on whether you are ready to see. Your grandmother could see us because she understood that the universe is far stranger and more wonderful than most of your kind believes. You have inherited that understanding." The visitor returned to its craft, which lifted off and disappeared into the night sky. Eleanor walked back to the house, feeling changed in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She had been given a gift, a glimpse into the true nature of reality that few humans ever received. The lights still come on Tuesday nights, though not as regularly as before. Sometimes Elena watches from her window. Sometimes she goes out to the pasture and waits. She doesn't always see them, but she knows they're there, continuing their patient study of a world in transition. And sometimes, on very clear nights when the stars seem especially bright, Eleanor thinks she can hear them calling to her, inviting her to expand her understanding even further. She hasn't accepted that invitation yet, but she knows that someday, when the time is right, she will. Marcus had been driving truck for 15 years when he encountered something that made him question everything he thought he knew about the highways that crisscross America. It was a Tuesday night in early November, and he was hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Denver, running ahead of schedule on I-25 through the empty stretches of New Mexico. The desert highway was familiar territory for Marcus. He'd driven this route dozens of times, knew every truck stop and rest area between Albuquerque and Colorado Springs. It was monotonous work, but he preferred the solitude to the chaos of city driving. Out here, under the vast dome of the southwestern sky, he could think clearly and enjoy the simple rhythm of the road. He was about 50 miles north of Santa Fe when he first noticed the lights in his mirrors. 3 bright points of light following behind him, maintaining a steady distance of maybe half a mile. At first, Marcus assumed it was another truck convoy, maybe military vehicles heading north from one of the bases in the area. But as he watched, he realized the lights weren't behaving like normal vehicles. They were too bright, for one thing, and they moved with a precision that seemed impossible for anything driving on the rough desert highway. They maintained perfect formation, never wavering from their positions relative to each other, never adjusting for curves or hills in the road. It was like watching 3 stars that had decided to follow him north. Marcus tried speeding up, pushing his rig to 75 miles per hour. The lights matched his speed effortlessly. He slowed down to 60. They slowed down too. When he pulled into the right lane and dropped to 55, the lights moved with him, maintaining that same half-mile distance. After about 20 minutes of this strange escort, Marcus decided to pull over at a rest area and see what would happen. He'd been driving long enough to develop a healthy respect for the unusual, and these lights were definitely unusual. Better to be cautious than sorry. The rest area was one of those basic desert stops. A few picnic tables, some vending machines, and restrooms that looked like they'd been built in the 1970s and hadn't been updated since. Marcus parked his truck and climbed down from the cab, his eyes scanning the highway for signs of his mysterious followers. The lights had stopped too, he saw. They hovered about a quarter-mile away, just off the side of the highway. But they weren't on the ground. They hung in the air about 50 feet up, motionless and silent. In the clear desert air, Marcus could see them more clearly now. They weren't vehicles at all. They were objects of some kind, each about the size of a small house, with a soft luminescence that seemed to come from within. Marcus had served in the military before becoming a trucker, and he'd seen plenty of experimental aircraft during his time at various bases. These weren't like anything in the military inventory. They had no visible means of propulsion, no wings or rotors, no exhaust signatures. They simply hung there in the night air like three impossible moons. He stood by his truck for several minutes, watching and being watched. The objects didn't move, didn't change their configuration. They simply waited, as if they were as curious about him as he was about them. The desert around him was absolutely silent, except for the distant hum of the highway and the occasional coyote call. Marcus had always been a practical man, someone who dealt with problems by facing them head-on. So after a few minutes of mutual observation, he did something that surprised even himself. He walked toward the objects. He covered about 100 yards before the closest object began to move. It descended slowly, gracefully, until it was hovering just above the desert floor, about 50 yards ahead of him. Marcus stopped walking and waited to see what would happen next. The object was even stranger up close. Its surface seemed to ripple and shift like liquid mercury, but it maintained a consistent ovoid shape about 30 feet long and 20 feet wide. There were no visible seams or openings, no lights or markings of any kind, just that soft pearl-like glow that made the surrounding desert cacti cast long, sharp shadows. As Marcus watched, a section of the object's surface simply wasn't there anymore. Not opened like a door, just absent, revealing a dark interior that seemed to extend much deeper than the object's external dimensions should have allowed. A figure emerged from this opening, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The being was humanoid, but clearly not human. It stood about 7 feet tall, with elongated limbs and a head that was larger in proportion to its body than any person Marcus had ever seen. Its skin, if it was skin, had a translucent quality that seemed to glow faintly in the desert darkness. When it moved, it did so with a fluid grace that suggested it was perfectly adapted to an environment very different from Earth. The two of them regarded each other across the desert floor for a long moment. Marcus felt no fear, which surprised him. If anything, he felt a strange sense of recognition, as if he was meeting someone he'd been expecting his whole life without knowing it. When the being spoke, Marcus heard the words not with his ears, but directly in his mind. The voice was neither male nor female, but somehow both, and it carried undertones of vast intelligence and patient curiosity. "You are not afraid," it observed, and Marcus detected something like approval in the mental tone. "Should I be?" Marcus replied, finding that he could respond in the same way, his thoughts somehow translating into communication the being could understand. "Fear is a natural response to the unknown, but you have traveled far and seen much. Your mind is open to possibilities that others would reject." Marcus nodded. It was true. 15 years on the road had shown him things that didn't make it into any official reports. Lights in the sky that moved in ways that defied physics. Desert highways that seemed to lead to places that weren't on any map. Fellow truckers who told stories of lost time and strange encounters that they only shared with others who would understand. "What are you?" he asked. "We are observers," came the reply. "We study worlds where consciousness is emerging, where intelligence is learning to reach beyond its birthplace. Your species is at a critical juncture. Some of you are beginning to understand that you are not alone in the universe." The being gestured to the other two objects, which had descended and were now resting silently on the desert floor. "We have been watching your kind for a very long time. Most of your people are not ready for direct contact, but some individuals, like yourself, have developed the capacity to interact with us without losing their balance." Marcus thought about this. Why truckers? Why people like me? You travel the spaces between your population centers. You see the world from a different perspective than those who remain in one place. You understand that reality is larger and stranger than most of your kind believes, and you are accustomed to solitude, to making decisions without the influence of the crowd. They talked for what felt like hours, though Marcus's watch later showed that only 30 minutes had passed. The being told him about their world, a place where consciousness had evolved beyond the need for individual physical forms, where science and spirituality were aspects of the same quest for understanding. They had been traveling between stars for millions of years, studying the development of intelligence wherever they found it. In return, Marcus shared his perspective on humanity, its struggles and achievements, its potential and its limitations. The being listened with what seemed like genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that revealed a deep understanding of human nature. "Your species is approaching a choice point," the being told him as their conversation drew to a close. "You can continue to develop as isolated individuals competing for resources, or you can begin to understand that consciousness is something you share, something that connects you not only to each other, but to all life in the universe." "Which way do you think we'll go?" Marcus asked. "That remains to be seen. But individuals like yourself give us hope. You prove that your species has the capacity for wisdom, for growth beyond your current limitations." The being began to move back toward its craft. "We will continue to watch, to wait, to offer guidance when it is requested. Some of your people are already working with us, though they may not realize it. Scientists, artists, visionaries who are pushing the boundaries of the morning mist clung to the Cascade foothills as I started what I thought would be another routine day of forest monitoring. My name is David, and I work for the Department of Natural Resources, cataloging wildlife patterns in remote wilderness areas. It's solitary work, which suits me fine. Just me, my gear, and my German Shepherd mix, Ranger, who's been my field companion for 3 years. That particular Tuesday in early November, I was investigating reports of unusual tree damage in a section of old-growth forest about 40 miles northeast of Seattle. The previous week, a logging crew had reported finding several Douglas firs that appeared to have been stripped of their bark in perfect spiral patterns, something they'd never seen before. My job was to determine if it was disease, insects, or some other natural phenomenon. The hike in took about 2 hours along an unmarked trail that wound through increasingly dense timber. Ranger stayed close, occasionally stopping to investigate scents I couldn't detect. The forest felt different that morning, quieter than usual. Even the typical sounds of woodpeckers and chattering squirrels seemed muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. When we reached the reported area, I immediately understood why the logging crew had been confused. 3 massive Douglas firs, each at least a century old, stood in a rough triangle formation. Their bark had been removed in precise helical strips from base to crown, creating an almost decorative pattern. But what struck me as truly odd was how clean the work appeared. There were no wood chips scattered around the base of the trees, no saw marks, no evidence of machinery or tools. I spent the first hour taking photographs and measurements, documenting everything according to protocol. The spiral patterns were identical on all 3 trees, each strip exactly 4 inches wide, with 6 inches of intact bark between them. The exposed wood underneath showed no signs of insect damage or disease. It was as if someone had carefully peeled away the bark with surgical precision. Ranger had been unusually restless since we'd arrived, pacing in wide circles around the trees and occasionally whining softly. He's normally a calm dog, focused and professional in the field, so his behavior concerned me. Every few minutes, he'd stop and stare up at the canopy, ears perked forward, tail rigid. As I worked, I began to notice other anomalies. The ground within the triangle formed by the 3 trees was completely barren of vegetation. Not just dead or dying plants, but absolutely nothing grew there. The soil itself appeared to have been somehow sterilized. When I tested it with my portable pH meter, the readings were so alkaline they were off the scale. Around noon, I was kneeling beside one of the trees, collecting soil samples, when Ranger suddenly bolted. He ran about 50 yards toward the tree line, then stopped and began barking. Not his usual alert bark, but something I'd never heard before, a low, almost mournful sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. I called to him, but he wouldn't return. Instead, he sat perfectly still, staring into the forest beyond the damaged trees. Following his gaze, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement deep in the shadows between the firs. Something large and pale, shifting just at the edge of visibility. That's when I heard it, a sound like nothing I'd encountered in 15 years of forest work. It started as a low humming, barely audible, but gradually increased in both volume and pitch. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet and resonating in my chest. It wasn't mechanical, more organic somehow, like the earth itself was singing. The humming continued for perhaps 3 minutes, during which time I stood frozen beside the damaged tree, my hand pressed against its spiraled trunk. The exposed wood felt warm to the touch, far warmer than the ambient air temperature should have allowed. As the sound reached its peak, I swear I could feel a pulse within the tree, as if some kind of energy was flowing through it. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the humming stopped. The sudden silence was almost deafening. Even the wind seemed to have died completely. Ranger remained motionless, still staring into the forest, but his barking had ceased. I spent another hour at the site, but found no additional evidence to explain what I'd experienced. The trees remained as mysteriously damaged as before, the soil just as barren, and the forest just as unnaturally quiet. When I finally decided to leave, Ranger reluctantly followed, though he kept looking back over his shoulder as we made our way to the trail. The hike out was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. Several times I stopped and turned around, certain I'd heard footsteps behind us, but saw nothing except the empty trail winding through the timber. Back at the office, I filed my report as required, documenting the spiral bark damage and the unusual soil conditions. I made no mention of the humming sound or the sense of being watched. How could I? There was no physical evidence to support those observations, and I knew how such claims would be received by my supervisors. But 3 days later, I received a call from the logging foreman. He told me they'd returned to the area to begin selective harvesting in an adjacent section of forest. The 3 damaged trees were gone, not cut down or fallen, simply absent, as if they'd never existed. In their place was a small circular clearing with grass growing normally. I drove back to the site that same afternoon. The foreman was right. Where the spirally damaged Douglas firs had stood, I found only an open patch of forest floor covered in healthy vegetation. There was no evidence that large trees had ever grown there, no stumps, no disturbed soil, no gaps in the forest canopy above. I searched the surrounding area for any sign of the missing trees, but found nothing. It was as if they had simply vanished, taking with them the only physical proof of what I'd witnessed. Even the soil pH readings were normal when I tested them again. In my final report, I attributed the initial logging crew's concerns to a case of mistaken location. I suggested they had likely observed naturally fallen trees in a different section of forest and become confused about the coordinates. It was a reasonable explanation that satisfied my superiors and closed the case. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I felt that morning in the Cascades. Something had been at work in that forest, something that left its mark on those ancient trees before erasing all evidence of its presence. The precision of the bark removal, the sterile soil, the warm pulse within the wood, the otherworldly humming, all of it suggested an intelligence far beyond anything in my experience. I still work these forests, still file my reports and document the natural world as I find it. But now I pay attention to the subtle signs, the places where the usual patterns don't quite fit. I've learned that the wilderness holds secrets that our scientific instruments can't measure and our protocols can't explain. Ranger is more alert too, as if that day changed something in him as well. Sometimes when we're deep in the timber, he'll stop and stare into the shadows between the trees, his ears forward and his body tense. And sometimes, if I listen very carefully, I think I can hear it again, that low humming that seems to rise from the earth itself, carrying messages in a language older than words. I've never reported another anomaly like the one from that November morning, but I've encountered them. Strange clearings where nothing grows, trees that seem to pulse with their own inner light, areas where my compass spins wildly and my radio picks up signals that sound almost like voices. I document what I can through conventional means and file reports that explain away the inexplicable. Because some truths are too large for official paperwork, too strange for bureaucratic minds to accept. But they're no less real for being unrecorded. Deep in the ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest, something moves between the trees, leaving traces of its passage for those who know how to look. The work continues, the mysteries deepen, and the woods keep their secrets well. But I'm listening now, watching for the signs that others might dismiss as natural phenomena, because I learned that morning that nature holds wonders far beyond our current understanding, and some of those wonders might not be natural at all. The campfire crackled softly in the distance as I settled deeper into my sleeping bag, but sleep wouldn't come. Something had been bothering me about the woods all evening. The usual forest sounds seemed muted, almost deliberately quiet, and there was an odd quality to the air that I couldn't quite place. My name is David, and I've been camping in remote locations for over 15 years. I thought I'd experienced everything these wilderness areas had to offer, but that night in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State would challenge everything I believed about what exists in our world. I was camping alone near a small alpine lake, about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead. It was mid-September, and the autumn air carried that crisp bite that makes you feel truly alive. I'd chosen this spot because it was well off the beaten path. No other campers, no hiking trails nearby, just pristine wilderness and the kind of solitude that helps you remember who you are beneath all the noise of modern life. My golden retriever, Murphy, had been my companion on these trips for the past 3 years. He was usually alert but calm in the outdoors, comfortable with the night sounds and forest rhythms. But that evening, Murphy was different. He kept pacing around our small campsite, ears constantly swiveling toward the tree line. Every few minutes he'd stop and stare intently into the darkness beyond our fire's reach, his body rigid with attention. I tried to calm him, assuming he'd caught the scent of deer, or perhaps a bear passing through the area, but his behavior was unlike anything I'd seen from him before. There was an intelligence to his alertness, as if he was tracking something that required his full concentration. Around 10:30, I decided to bank the fire and turn in for the night. The temperature was dropping, and I wanted to get settled in my tent before it became uncomfortable. Murphy reluctantly followed me into the tent, but instead of curling up in his usual spot near my feet, He positioned himself facing the entrance, his ears still perked and his breathing shallow. I remember thinking it was odd, but exhaustion from a long day of hiking was beginning to take hold. I must have dozed off around 11, but I was awakened sometime later by the strangest sound I'd ever heard in the wilderness. It started as a low humming, almost musical in nature, coming from somewhere beyond our campsite. The tone was pure and sustained, unlike any animal call or natural phenomenon I could identify. It seemed to emanate from multiple directions at once, creating an almost harmonious resonance that made the air itself feel different. Murphy was sitting upright beside me, completely motionless, except for the slight trembling I could feel through his body. He wasn't growling or showing signs of fear exactly, but rather an intense fascination mixed with something I can only describe as reverence. The humming continued for several minutes, rising and falling in gentle waves, and I found myself strangely calmed by it, despite the mysterious nature of its source. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind through the trees, no insects chirping, no small animals rustling through the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Murphy and I sat there in that profound quiet for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Then, gradually, the normal night sounds returned, and Murphy finally relaxed enough to lie down. The next morning brought brilliant sunshine and crisp mountain air that made the previous night's experience feel almost dreamlike. I might have dismissed it entirely if not for what I discovered when I went to refill our water bottles at the lake. There, in the soft mud along the shoreline, were impressions unlike anything I'd seen before. They were roughly circular, about 18 inches in diameter, and pressed deep into the earth as if made by something extremely heavy. But what struck me most was their perfect symmetry and the way they seemed to have been placed rather than made by something walking. The impressions formed a precise line leading from the water's edge toward the area where I'd heard the humming the night before. I followed them as far as I could, but they disappeared when the terrain became too rocky to hold clear prints. Murphy showed renewed interest in the area, sniffing intently at each impression and following the trail with the same focused attention he'd displayed the previous evening. I spent the rest of that day exploring the area more thoroughly, looking for any conventional explanation for what we'd experienced. There were no signs of other campers, no evidence of machinery or vehicles that could have made those sounds or impressions. The more I investigated, the more convinced I became that Murphy and I had witnessed something truly extraordinary. That evening, I made a decision that would change my perspective on camping forever. Instead of packing up and heading home as planned, I decided to stay another night. I wanted to see if whatever had visited our area would return. Murphy seemed to sense my intention and spent the day in a state of quiet alertness, as if he too was preparing for something significant. As darkness fell, I built up the fire and settled in to wait. Murphy took his position facing the tree line, and we sat together in comfortable anticipation. The forest sounds were more normal that second night, with the usual chorus of insects and the occasional call of a night bird. But around the same time as the previous evening, that profound silence descended again. This time, the humming was accompanied by something else. Soft lights began to appear among the trees, not harsh or electric-looking, but with a gentle, organic quality that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the mysterious sounds. They moved slowly through the forest, weaving between the trees with an intelligence and purpose that took my breath away. Murphy watched with what I can only describe as joy, his tail wagging slowly as he tracked the light's movement. The lights came closer to our campsite than I would have expected, stopping perhaps 50 feet away at the edge of the firelight. From that distance, I could see that they weren't separate objects, but rather emanations from something larger that remained hidden in the shadows. The humming grew more complex, layering harmonies that seemed to communicate emotions rather than words. I felt an overwhelming sense of peace and welcome, as if we were being acknowledged by intelligence that bore us no ill will. The encounter lasted perhaps 20 minutes before the lights gradually faded and the humming diminished to silence. But this time, instead of the complete quiet that had followed the previous night's experience, I heard something that sounded almost like a gentle farewell. Murphy whined softly and took a few steps toward where the lights had been, his posture suggesting he wanted to follow, but understood he should stay with me. When morning came, I found new impressions near our campsite, these ones smaller and more numerous, arranged in patterns that suggested some kind of gathering or meeting had taken place just beyond where I could see. Murphy spent the morning investigating these new markings with the same intense interest, occasionally looking back at me as if trying to communicate what he was sensing. I've returned to that area several times since then, always with Murphy, and while we've never experienced anything quite as dramatic as those first 2 nights, there's an ongoing sense that we're not alone in those woods. Sometimes we hear distant humming carried on the evening breeze, and Murphy always alerts to sounds and scents that I can't detect. I've found additional impressions on subsequent visits, always in different locations, but bearing the same characteristics of intentional placement and impossible weight distribution. The experience has fundamentally changed how I think about wilderness and our place in the natural world. I've become more attuned to subtle signs and sounds that I might have dismissed before, more aware of the possibility that intelligence exists in forms we don't yet understand. Murphy has become an even more trusted companion, his instincts clearly more developed than mine when it comes to detecting the unusual. I've shared this account with only a few close friends, most of whom listen politely, but clearly think I've spent too much time alone in the mountains. But I know what Murphy and I experienced was real, and I know we were privileged to witness something remarkable. Whatever intelligence visited our campsite those nights showed us nothing but curiosity and kindness, leaving us with memories that have enriched rather than frightened our subsequent wilderness adventures. The woods hold more mysteries than most of us ever imagine, and sometimes, if we're patient and respectful, they share those mysteries with us. Murphy and I continue to camp in remote locations, always hoping for another encounter with the gentle intelligence that showed us such unexpected grace on those autumn nights in the Cascades. Whether or not we ever experience anything similar again, we've been changed by knowing that we share this world with forms of consciousness that exist just beyond the edges of our everyday understanding. The humming still echoes in my memory during quiet moments, a reminder that the universe holds wonders we've barely begun to comprehend, and that sometimes the most profound experiences come to those who venture far enough from civilization to encounter the truly unknown. I walked to the edge of the clearing where my tent was pitched, listening to the soft murmur of the stream about 30 yards away. The late autumn air carried that distinct smell of decomposing leaves and the faint scent of wood smoke from dying embers. My dog Ranger, a Belgian Malinois mix with alert amber eyes, had been restless all evening, pacing around the campsite and occasionally stopping to stare into the tree line with his ears perked forward. I'd chosen this spot in the Cascade Range specifically because it was isolated. No marked trails led here, just an old game path that wound through dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock. The nearest road was 3 miles away, accessible only by a rough logging track that hadn't seen maintenance in years. I wanted complete solitude to clear my head after a difficult few months at work. The first 2 nights had been peaceful. I'd fallen asleep to the sound of owls calling across the valley and woken to the chatter of squirrels and the distant drumming of woodpeckers. Ranger had seemed content, exploring the area during the day and sleeping soundly beside my sleeping bag at night. But this third evening felt different. The forest had grown unusually quiet as darkness settled in. No insect chorus, no rustling of small mammals in the underbrush. Even the stream seemed to flow more quietly than before. Ranger wouldn't settle down, constantly moving to different positions around the camp and occasionally emitting low whines that seemed to come from deep in his chest. Around midnight, I was lying in my tent reading by flashlight when I heard it. A sound like nothing I'd encountered before, a low harmonic vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't mechanical, not like an engine or generator. It was more organic, almost musical, but with an underlying pulse that I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. I turned off my flashlight and listened. The sound continued for perhaps 2 minutes, rising and falling in gentle waves. Ranger had gone completely silent, and when I reached out to touch him, I found him lying rigid, every muscle tense. The vibration seemed to be coming from above, though when I looked up through the tent's mesh window, I saw only the familiar canopy of branches silhouetted against a star-filled sky. When the sound faded, it left behind a silence so complete it felt oppressive. I waited for the normal night sounds to return, but they didn't. Even the stream had gone quiet. I lay there for what felt like hours, checking my watch periodically. The luminous dial showed normal progression of time, but something felt wrong about the quality of that time, as if each minute was stretching longer than it should. Eventually, I must have dozed, because I woke to find pale dawn light filtering through the tent walls. Ranger was already sitting up, alert and watching me. When I emerged from the tent, the forest looked exactly as it had the day before, but it felt fundamentally changed. The air itself seemed thicker, more substantial, and colors appeared slightly more saturated than they should have been. I packed up quickly, eager to leave. As I loaded my gear, I noticed something that made me pause. The ground around my campsite, which had been covered in a normal scatter of fallen leaves and forest debris, now showed a perfect circle of bare earth, about 15 feet in diameter. The soil within this circle was darker than the surrounding ground, almost black, and had a faint metallic smell. I knelt and touched the earth. It was warm, noticeably warmer than the morning air temperature. When I pressed my palm to it, I felt a subtle vibration, like a very slow heartbeat deep underground. The sensation was unsettling, and I pulled my hand away quickly. Looking more carefully at the circle, I noticed that the trees at its perimeter showed signs of stress. Their bark appeared darker, almost scorched, though there was no smell of burning. Some of the lower branches had shed their needles, creating small piles of brown vegetation at the base of each trunk. I called Ranger, who had been sniffing at the edge of the circle, but refused to step inside it. He came to me immediately, something he rarely did without the usual games and delays. His eagerness to leave was obvious, and it matched my own growing sense of unease. As we hiked out, I found myself looking back over my shoulder repeatedly. The forest behind us appeared normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching our departure. The sensation persisted until we reached the logging road where I'd parked my truck. It wasn't until I was driving home that I realized I had no memory of hearing that strange vibration end. I remembered it beginning, remembered lying awake listening to it, but I couldn't recall the moment it stopped. It was as if that part of the night had been carefully edited out of my experience. I've returned to that general area several times since, but I've never been able to find the exact spot where I camped. The terrain all looks similar, dense forest broken by small clearings and creek beds, but none of the clearings feel right. None have that particular configuration of trees and water that I remember so clearly. I've also never heard that sound again, though sometimes on very quiet nights when I'm camping elsewhere, I find myself listening for it. Part of me hopes I never encounter it again, but another part of me wonders what would have happened if I'd stayed another night, if I'd been brave enough to step outside my tent and look up at the source of that impossible vibration. Ranger never showed any lasting effects from our experience, but he's never been quite as eager to explore new places. He stays closer to me now when we're in unfamiliar territory, and he has an odd habit of looking up at the sky during our evening walks, as if he's watching for something that might return. I've researched acoustic phenomena, electromagnetic anomalies, geological events that might explain what we experienced. Nothing fits exactly. The closest I've found are reports of infrasound, frequencies below human hearing that can create feelings of unease and disorientation. But infrasound doesn't create visible circles of disturbed earth, and it doesn't make trees shed their needles overnight. Sometimes I think about filing a report with Park Services or the Forestry Department. But what would I tell them? That I heard an unexplained sound and found a circle of warm earth? They'd likely attribute it to natural causes I'm not educated enough to recognize, and they'd probably be right. But on clear nights, when I'm far from city lights, I still find myself scanning the sky and listening to the ambient sounds of the forest with the attention I never had before. Because whatever created that vibration, whatever left that mark on the earth, it felt deliberate. It felt like communication, like something trying to make contact in a way that wouldn't cause panic or fear. I don't know if I hope to encounter it again, or if I hope I never do. But I know that experience changed something fundamental about how I perceive the world around me. The forest is no longer just trees and wildlife and natural processes. It's also a place where impossible things can happen quietly, leaving only subtle traces for those observant enough to notice them. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the world is at its quietest, I wonder if that communication was successful. If something out there now knows that at least one person was listening, was paying attention, was ready to acknowledge that we're not alone in this vast and mysterious universe. In the deep hollows of West Virginia, where the mountains swallow the last echoes of civilization, there are stories that slip between the cracks of what we call reality. These are encounters with something beyond our understanding, something that watches from the spaces between shadow and starlight. The first account comes from a man who worked the night shift at a rural power substation, monitoring the electrical grid that fed the scattered communities nestled in these ancient hills. His job was routine, methodical: check the readings, log the data, ensure the steady flow of power to homes and businesses miles away. But on certain nights, when the fog rolled thick through the valleys and the world seemed to hold its breath, the routine would break. It started with the lights, not the harsh fluorescent strips inside the control room, but something else. Points of illumination that appeared in the forest beyond the chain-link fence, moving with deliberate purpose between the trees. At first, he thought they might be hunters with flashlights, though hunting at night was illegal in these parts. The lights were too steady, too coordinated. They moved in patterns that suggested intelligence, but not human intelligence. The lights would appear around 2 in the morning, when the world was at its quietest. They would emerge from different sections of the tree line, converging on a point roughly 50 yards from the substation. There, they would hover, pulsing gently, like fireflies caught in amber. The man would watch from his window, feeling a strange mixture of fascination and unease. The lights never approached the fence, never crossed into the cleared area around the electrical equipment. They simply observed. On the third night of this phenomenon, the man decided to investigate. He grabbed a heavy flashlight and stepped outside, his breath forming clouds in the cold mountain air. The moment his boots touched the gravel, the lights vanished, not gradually, not one by one, but all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. He stood there for nearly an hour, sweeping his flashlight beam across the tree line, but saw nothing more unusual than the bare branches of winter oaks and the pale bark of birches. The next night, the lights returned. This time, he noticed something different. The electrical readings on his monitoring equipment showed subtle fluctuations whenever the lights appeared. Nothing dramatic enough to cause problems, but consistent variations in the power flow that corresponded exactly with the presence of the illuminated visitors. It was as if they were somehow interacting with the electrical field around the substation, drawing energy or perhaps studying the flow of current through the transmission lines. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. The lights would appear, maintain their vigil for exactly 1 hour and 17 minutes, then disappear. The man began to time their arrival and departure with increasing precision, noting that they kept to their schedule with clockwork regularity. He considered reporting the incidents to his supervisor, but what would he say? That mysterious lights were conducting surveillance on the power grid? That something intelligent was studying their electrical infrastructure? The breakthrough came on a night when an ice storm had knocked out power to several towns in the valley. The man was working frantically to reroute electricity through alternate lines when the lights appeared earlier than usual. This time, they didn't maintain their usual distance. They moved closer to the fence, their glow intensifying as they approached the electrical equipment. The man watched in amazement as the power fluctuations on his monitors began to stabilize. Somehow, the presence of these lights was helping to regulate the electrical flow, compensating for the damaged infrastructure. For the next 3 hours, as he worked to restore power to the affected communities, the lights remained. They seemed to be assisting, their energy harmonizing with the electrical systems in ways that defied conventional understanding. When the last circuit was restored and power flowed steady and strong to every home in the valley, the lights performed what could only be described as a celebration. They rose higher into the air, formed a perfect circle, pulsed once in unison, and then vanished. The man never saw the lights again after that night, but sometimes, during particularly difficult maintenance work, or when storm damage threatened the grid, he would notice that the electrical systems seemed to function with unusual efficiency. Circuits that should have failed held steady. Power flows that should have been unstable remained constant. It was as if something unseen was still there, still helping, still watching over the flow of energy that kept the mountain communities alive. Another account comes from a woman who lived alone in a cabin on the edge of the Monongahela National Forest. She had moved there, seeking solitude after the death of her husband, wanting nothing more than the peace of the wilderness and the company of her aging German shepherd, Max. The cabin was simple but comfortable, heated by a wood stove and powered by solar panels that her late husband had installed years before. The strangeness began on a November evening when she was reading by lamplight. Max, normally content to sleep by the fire, suddenly raised his head and stared intently at the front door. His ears were erect, his body tense, but he made no sound. She listened carefully, but heard nothing beyond the usual whisper of wind through the pines. After several minutes, Max relaxed and returned to his nap, but the woman remained uneasy. The next night, it happened again. This time, Max rose to his feet and walked to the door, pressing his nose against the wood. She could see his nostrils flaring as he took in some scent that was invisible to her. When she opened the door to investigate, Max refused to step outside. He backed away from the threshold, whimpering softly, his tail tucked between his legs. On the third night, she decided to keep watch. She turned off all the lights in the cabin and positioned herself at the window. Max curled nervously at her feet. At precisely 11:30, she saw them. Figures moving through the trees, tall and graceful, their forms barely visible against the darkness. They seemed to glide rather than walk, their movements too fluid for anything entirely human. She counted at least 7 of them, possibly more, moving in single file along a deer path that led past her cabin. The figures showed no interest in her dwelling. They passed by as if it were just another tree or boulder in their path. But as the last one drew near the edge of her property, it stopped and turned toward the cabin. Though she could make out no features in the darkness, she felt with absolute certainty that it was looking directly at her. The sensation lasted only a moment before the figure continued on its way, disappearing into the deeper forest. Night after night, the procession continued. Always the same route, always the same time, always the same number of figures. The woman began to think of them as pilgrims, traveling some ancient path for reasons she could never hope to understand. Max grew accustomed to their presence, though he never stopped reacting to their approach. His behavior became her early warning system, alerting her to prepare for their passage. Winter deepened, and with it came a blizzard that dumped 3 feet of snow across the mountains. The woman worried that she might be snowed in for weeks, but she had prepared well and felt confident in her ability to wait out the storm. What she hadn't expected was for the power to fail on the second night of the blizzard, when the solar panels were buried under snow and the backup batteries had finally drained. Without power, the cabin grew cold quickly. She built up the fire in the wood stove, but it wasn't enough to heat the entire space. By the 3rd night, ice was forming on the inside of the windows, and she was burning furniture to keep the fire going. Max pressed close to her for warmth, and she began to wonder if they would survive until the storm passed. That night, as she huddled under every blanket she owned, she heard something different outside. Not the usual whisper of wind through snow-laden branches, but a sound like singing. Soft, wordless melodies that seemed to come from multiple voices, harmonizing in perfect pitch. She looked out the window and saw the figures again, but this time they had stopped their procession. They stood in a circle around her cabin, their forms more visible now against the white snow. As she watched, a warm glow began to emanate from where they stood. It wasn't fire or electric light, but something else entirely, something that seemed to generate heat without flame. The temperature in the cabin began to rise. The ice on the windows melted and ran down the glass in tiny rivulets. Max lifted his head, and for the first time since the figures had started appearing, his tail wagged. The singing continued through the night, and with it came the warmth that kept them alive. When dawn broke clear and bright, the figures were gone, but the cabin remained warm. The woman ventured outside to clear the snow from her solar panels and found that the snow around her cabin had melted in a perfect circle, as if spring had come early to that one small patch of earth. The storm ended that day, and power returned to her systems. But the woman never forgot the kindness of the strange pilgrims who had shared their warmth with a stranger in need. She continued to watch for them on their nightly journeys, and sometimes, when the wind was right, she thought she could still hear echoes of their wordless songs carried on the mountain air. The 3rd account comes from a family who operated a small observatory on a ridge overlooking the New River Valley. The father was an amateur astronomer who had built the facility as a retirement project, installing a modest but capable telescope and opening it to the public on clear weekend nights. His wife helped with the educational programs, and their teenage daughter had grown up learning to navigate the night sky with the same ease that other children learned to read maps. Their encounters began during a meteor shower in late August. The family was hosting a viewing party for local astronomy enthusiasts when the daughter noticed something unusual. Among the expected streaks of burning debris, there were other lights moving across the sky. These weren't meteors or satellites or aircraft. They moved with purpose, changing direction in ways that defied the laws of physics as she understood them. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. But when she called her father's attention to the anomalous lights, he confirmed what she was seeing through the telescope. Objects of unknown origin were weaving between the meteor trails like dancers, following some cosmic choreography. They were spherical, glowing with their own soft luminescence, and they seemed to be observing the meteor shower with the same interest as the human watchers below. The father, a retired engineer with a practical mind, immediately began documenting what they were seeing. He adjusted the telescope's camera system to record the lights, noting their positions relative to known stars and their apparent size and brightness. What emerged from his careful observations was a pattern of behavior that suggested intelligence and curiosity. The lights appeared to be studying the meteors, moving closer to the brightest fireballs and following their paths across the sky. When a particularly spectacular meteor blazed across the heavens, Multiple lights would converge on its trajectory, as if analyzing its composition or trajectory. They showed particular interest in meteors that survived their passage through the atmosphere, tracking the likely impact points with mathematical precision. Over the following months, the lights became regular visitors to the night sky above the observatory. They appeared most often during astronomical events, meteor showers, planetary alignments, lunar eclipses, as if they too were interested in the celestial mechanics that fascinated human astronomers. The family began to think of them as fellow skywatchers, cosmic neighbors with a shared appreciation for the wonders of the universe. The most remarkable encounter occurred during a rare aurora display that extended far enough south to be visible from West Virginia. The northern lights painted the sky in shades of green and purple, a spectacle that drew observers from across the region to the family's observatory. As the aurora danced overhead, the mysterious lights appeared in greater numbers than ever before. But this time, they didn't simply observe from a distance. They began to interact with the aurora itself, moving in and out of the luminous curtains like swimmers diving through phosphorescent waves. Where they passed, the colors of the aurora intensified and shifted, creating patterns that seemed almost like a form of communication. The lights were talking to the aurora, or perhaps through it, using the charged particles in the upper atmosphere as a medium for their message. The daughter, now studying astrophysics in college, had brought sophisticated recording equipment with her for the aurora viewing. Her instruments detected electromagnetic signatures, unlike anything in the scientific literature. The lights were generating complex patterns of radio waves, magnetic field variations, and other phenomena that suggested technology far beyond human capability. As the night progressed, the aurora display took on characteristics that no textbook had ever described. Instead of the typical random fluctuations of charged particles following magnetic field lines, the lights began to form geometric patterns, spirals, and what could only be described as symbols. It was as if the sky itself had become a vast screen for displaying information in a language written in light and magnetism. The family and their guests watched in awe as this cosmic conversation unfolded above them. Some of the symbols seemed almost familiar, reminiscent of mathematical concepts or astronomical diagrams, while others were completely alien. The display continued for hours, far longer than any normal aurora, sustained by the presence and interaction of the mysterious lights. When dawn finally began to lighten the eastern horizon, the aurora faded and the lights departed one by one. But before the last one vanished, it descended lower than any had before, hovering directly above the observatory. Through the telescope, the family could see that it wasn't simply a ball of light, but something more complex. There were structures within the glow, geometric forms that suggested purposeful construction. The light pulsed once, twice, 3 times, and then shot skyward with impossible acceleration, leaving behind a brief trail that looked like a signature written in starfire. In the days that followed, the family analyzed their recordings and found embedded within the electromagnetic data what appeared to be mathematical sequences, star charts, and other information that would take years to fully decode. The lights continued to visit their observatory, though never again with the spectacular display of that aurora night. They became part of the family's routine, expected guests who shared their love of the cosmos. The daughter's research into the electromagnetic phenomena she had recorded eventually formed the basis of her doctoral dissertation, though she never revealed the true source of her data. These accounts, and dozens of others like them, paint a picture of something extraordinary happening in the mountains of West Virginia. Beings of unknown origin, possessed of technology that seems like magic to our limited understanding, moving through our world with purposes we can barely comprehend. They are observers, students, perhaps even guardians, watching over the delicate balance of energy that sustains our modern civilization. They seem drawn to places where human technology intersects with natural forces, power stations, observatories, remote installations, where the boundary between the artificial and the natural grows thin. They show interest in our activities, but maintain a careful distance, revealing themselves only to those who have learned to watch the spaces between shadow and starlight. What they want, where they come from, why they choose to reveal themselves to some and remain hidden from others. These questions remain unanswered. But for those who have encountered them, the experience leaves an indelible mark, a sense that we are not alone in the universe, that intelligence takes forms beyond our imagination, and that even in the most remote corners of our world, we are being watched by eyes that see far more than we do. The mountains of West Virginia keep their secrets well, but for those who know how to look, who have learned to read the signs written in unusual electrical fluctuations and unexplained lights moving through the darkness, the truth is there. We share this world with others, beings whose presence is as real as the ancient peaks and valleys they call home. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is suspended between night and day, they continue their work, watching, learning, perhaps protecting. The lights in the forest, the figures on the mountain paths, the intelligences that dance with auroras and stabilize power grids, they are all part of a larger tapestry of existence that extends far beyond our current understanding. And in the end, perhaps that is enough. To know that we are not alone, that intelligence and curiosity and even kindness exist in forms we never expected, in the spaces between what we know and what we imagine. The mountains remember, the lights continue their vigil, and those who have seen them carry their stories like small flames in the darkness, proof that the universe is far stranger and more wonderful than we ever dared to dream. I was sleeping when it happened. My tent was zipped tight against the cold mountain air, and my sleeping bag felt warm and secure around me. I'd been hiking for 3 days in the Cascade Mountains of Washington, following a trail that few people ever used. The silence up there was complete, the kind that makes your ears ring if you listen too hard. My dog Luna, a border collie mix, was curled up at my feet. She'd been my hiking companion for years, and I trusted her instincts more than my own sometimes. That night, she saved my life. I woke to the sound of her low growling, not the aggressive kind, but something deeper, more primal, the kind of sound she made when something wasn't right in the world. I opened my eyes and listened. The forest around us was silent, too silent. No wind in the trees, no night birds calling, no insects chirping, just an emptiness that felt wrong. Luna stood up and pressed herself against the tent wall, her body rigid. I could feel her trembling through the thin fabric. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent flap to peer outside. The clearing where I'd set up camp was bathed in a soft, pale light, not moonlight. The moon had set hours earlier. This was something else entirely. The light seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, casting no shadows, but illuminating everything with an ethereal glow. That's when I saw them. 3 figures stood at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 feet from my tent. They were tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet high. Their bodies were elongated and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for their frames. They wore no clothing that I could see, but their skin had a luminescent quality that seemed to absorb and reflect the strange light around us. They weren't moving. They just stood there, watching my tent. I couldn't make out their faces clearly, but I had the distinct impression that they knew I was awake, that they were waiting for me. Luna's growling intensified. I put my hand on her back, trying to calm her, but my own heart was racing. Every instinct told me to stay hidden, to pretend I was still asleep, but I couldn't look away. One of the figures raised what might have been an arm. The gesture was slow and deliberate, almost ceremonial. As it did, the light around us grew brighter. I could see more details now. Their heads were larger than human heads, elongated at the back. Their eyes, if they were eyes, were dark and seemed to take up most of their faces. The air began to hum. It was a low-frequency sound that I felt more than heard, vibrating through my chest and into my bones. Luna whimpered and tried to burrow deeper into the tent. The humming grew louder, more intense, until I thought my eardrums might burst. Then, without warning, it stopped. The figures were gone. The light faded until only starlight remained. The normal sounds of the forest slowly returned. Crickets, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Luna relaxed beside me, but she kept watching the spot where the figures had stood. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in my tent with my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other, listening to every sound, waiting for them to return. They didn't. When dawn finally came, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. I walked over to where the figures had been standing, looking for any sign that they'd been real. The grass was flattened in 3 perfect circles, each about 3 feet across. The ground inside the circles felt warm to the touch, even though the morning air was cold. I took pictures, but when I looked at them later, they showed nothing but normal grass and dirt. The warmth I'd felt was gone by the time I finished packing. The hike back to the trailhead took me 6 hours. Luna stayed close the entire time, occasionally looking back over her shoulder. She seemed as eager as I was to leave that place behind. I've told this story to a few people over the years. Most think I was dreaming or hallucinating from altitude and exhaustion. Maybe they're right. But Luna was awake too, and she saw what I saw. Animals don't hallucinate the way humans do. I've been back to the Cascades many times since then, but never to that particular trail. I'm not sure I ever will. Some experiences are meant to happen only once, and some places are meant to be left alone. But sometimes, when I'm camping in the wilderness and the night gets very quiet, I remember that humming sound. I remember the feeling of being watched by something that wasn't quite of this world, and I wonder if they're still out there, standing at the edges of clearings, waiting for the right person to find them, or maybe waiting for the right person to be ready for what they have to show us. The mountains hold many secrets. Most of them we're not meant to understand. But that night, for just a few minutes, I was allowed to glimpse something beyond our everyday world, something that reminded me how small we are and how much we still have to learn about the universe around us. Luna and I made it home safely that trip, but part of me never really left that clearing. Part of me is still there, watching those tall figures in the strange light, trying to understand what they wanted me to see. Sometimes I think they weren't there to frighten me. They were there to remind me that we're not alone, that there are others sharing this vast cosmos with us, others who watch and wait and occasionally reach out to make contact with those who are ready to receive their message. I don't know what that message was, but I know that night changed me. It opened my mind to possibilities I'd never considered before. It made me realize that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than most of us ever imagine, and in the quiet moments, when the night is still and the stars are bright, I sometimes feel that presence again, not threatening, not frightening, but watchful, patient, waiting for the day when we're ready to understand what they've been trying to tell us all along. The universe is vast and full of mysteries. Some of them come looking for us when we're alone in the wilderness, when our minds are quiet enough to perceive what's always been there, just beyond the edge of our awareness. That night in the Cascades, I learned that we're part of something much larger than ourselves, something that spans the stars and connects all living things in ways we're only beginning to understand. I'll carry that knowledge with me for the rest of my life. And maybe someday, when the time is right, I'll return to that clearing, not to seek them out, but to let them know that I'm ready to listen, ready to learn what they've been waiting so patiently to teach us. I can feel a profound shift settling over the world around us. The encounters we've explored tonight paint a picture of something far more complex than random visitations. From the silent craft pacing isolated highways, to the geometric patterns burned into remote clearings, from the lights that respond to human attention, to the beings who communicate through thought alone. We're witnessing evidence of an intelligence that operates by rules we're only beginning to understand. These aren't the dramatic invasions of science fiction. Instead, they reveal a presence that moves carefully, deliberately, almost cautiously through our world. The witnesses describe entities that seem genuinely curious about us, studying our reactions, our technology, our very consciousness. They approach individuals who are alone, vulnerable, away from the noise and skepticism of civilization. They leave behind traces that defy our physics, while remaining just beyond the reach of our instruments. What strikes me most deeply about these accounts is the pattern of change they describe in the witnesses themselves. People who encounter these phenomena often report a fundamental shift in how they perceive reality. They speak of feeling connected to something vast and ancient, of understanding that consciousness extends far beyond the boundaries of human experience. The beings they meet seem to operate on a level of awareness that encompasses not just our planet, but the intricate web of life that connects all living things across the cosmos. The messages, when they come, are rarely about technology or conquest. Instead, they speak of balance, of harmony, of humanity's role within a larger cosmic community. They suggest that our species stands at a crossroads, that the choices we make in the coming years will determine not just our own future, but our place in a universe teeming with intelligence. Perhaps most intriguingly, these encounters seem to be increasing in frequency and clarity. The veil between our reality and theirs appears to be thinning, as if we're approaching some kind of disclosure, some moment when the hidden becomes visible and the impossible becomes undeniable. The craft that once hid in clouds now hover openly over populated areas. The beings who once remained in shadow now make direct contact with increasing boldness. What does this mean for us? These stories suggest that we're living through a period of unprecedented change, a time when the boundaries between the known and unknown are dissolving. The intelligence behind these phenomena seems to be preparing us, gradually acclimating us to realities that would have been incomprehensible to previous generations. The witnesses tell us that these beings are already among us, walking through our cities, observing our progress, gently guiding our development towards something greater. They speak of a universe where consciousness is the fundamental force, where thoughts and intentions shape reality in ways our science is only beginning to discover. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let these stories remind you that we're part of something infinitely larger than ourselves. The same stars that shine down on these remote encounter sites shine down on you. The same cosmic forces that guide these mysterious visitors flow through your own consciousness. You are connected to every story we've shared, every witness who has stepped forward, every moment of contact between our world and theirs. Perhaps in your dreams, you'll glimpse the reality these encounters point toward. A universe where every living being is part of an interconnected web of consciousness, where the barriers between species and worlds are merely temporary illusions, where the next chapter of human evolution awaits just beyond the horizon of our current understanding. Sleep well, knowing that you're part of the greatest story ever told, a story that's still being written with each passing night, each new encounter, each moment when the impossible becomes possible and the hidden becomes revealed. We had been tracking strange weather patterns for weeks when the real encounter happened. I'm Sarah, and I work at the National Weather Service office outside Denver. Most nights, we're monitoring routine storms, pressure systems, the usual atmospheric movements across the Rocky Mountain region. But that October, we kept detecting anomalies that made no sense. The radar would show formations that didn't behave like any weather system we'd catalogued. Perfect circles of disturbance that moved against prevailing winds, maintaining their shape for hours before simply disappearing from our screens. No precipitation, no temperature changes, just these geometric voids in our atmospheric data. My supervisor, Marcus, had been with the service for 25 years. He'd seen microbursts, supercells, even rare atmospheric rivers. But these formations left him puzzled. "Sarah," he'd say, staring at the monitors, "run another calibration check. This equipment's giving us ghost readings." Except the equipment checked out perfectly. Every sensor, every satellite feed, every ground station confirmed what we were seeing. These weren't equipment failures or data corruption. Something was moving through our airspace that our meteorological models couldn't explain. The night everything changed started like any other. I was monitoring the overnight shift when the first formation appeared on radar around 2:17 a.m. It materialized suddenly about 30 miles northwest of the city, a perfect disk of atmospheric disturbance roughly 2 miles in diameter. Unlike previous sightings, this one was massive and completely stationary. I called Marcus at home. "You need to see this," I told him. "It's bigger than anything we've recorded." Within an hour, Marcus was at the office, along with Dr. Elena Vasquez, an atmospheric physicist from the university who'd been consulting with us on the anomalies. Elena had theories about electromagnetic interference from solar activity, but even she couldn't explain the consistency and precision of these formations. "Look at the pressure readings," Elena said, pointing at her tablet. "The center shows a complete absence of measurable atmospheric pressure. It's like there's a bubble of nothing in our sky." We watched the formation for 3 hours. It didn't drift, didn't change shape, didn't respond to the jet stream flowing around it. Weather systems don't behave this way. They're chaotic, unpredictable, constantly evolving. This thing was engineered. Around 5:30 a.m., something extraordinary happened. The formation began to descend, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Our altitude readings showed it dropping through cloud layers, through the flight levels where commercial aircraft operate, continuing down toward the surface. "Should we contact air traffic control?" I asked. Marcus was already on the phone, but when he checked with Denver International, they reported clear skies. Their radar showed nothing unusual. Only our weather service equipment was detecting the formation. As we watched, the descending disk passed through 10,000 feet, then 5,000, then 3,000. At 1,500 feet above ground level, it stopped, perfectly motionless again, hovering over a rural area northeast of the city where farmland meets the foothills. "I'm going out there," Elena announced. She'd been studying these anomalies for weeks and couldn't resist the opportunity for direct observation. Marcus tried to dissuade her, but Elena was determined. She packed her portable weather instruments and drove toward the coordinates, while Marcus and I maintained radio contact and tracked her progress. Eleanor's voice crackled through the radio around 7:15 a.m. "I'm about 2 miles from the coordinates. The sky looks normal from here, but my instruments are going crazy. Magnetic field fluctuations unlike anything I've measured." She continued driving until she reached a small farming community called Cedar Ridge. The residents were awake early, going about their morning routines, completely unaware that our equipment showed a massive atmospheric anomaly directly above their town. "It's invisible to the naked eye," Elena reported, "but my electromagnetic sensors are registering intense activity. It's like standing under a massive power generator." That's when Elena made contact. She'd set up her equipment in a field just outside town, taking measurements and trying to understand what our radar was detecting. The air was crisp and clear, typical autumn morning in Colorado. Nothing appeared unusual except for her instruments, which were recording readings that shouldn't exist in normal atmospheric conditions. "The electromagnetic field is intensifying," she radioed. "Whatever this is, it's aware I'm here." Marcus and I watched our screens as the formation began to respond to Elena's presence. The perfect circle started to shift, becoming more elliptical, oriented toward her exact location. "Elena, get out of there. Marcus commanded through the radio. But Elena's voice, when it came back, was different, calmer, almost serene. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I can see it now, not with my eyes, but with something deeper. It's not hiding from us. We just weren't looking in the right way." The formation on our radar began to pulse, expanding and contracting like a heartbeat. Elena's radio transmissions became intermittent, filled with static, but we could still hear her voice describing something that defied explanation. "They're not using technology the way we understand it," she said during a clear transmission. "This isn't mechanical. It's organic in some way, alive. The atmospheric disturbance isn't caused by their presence. It's how they communicate." For 20 minutes, Elena maintained contact while the formation pulsed above her. She described sensations of weightlessness, of her consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of her physical body. She spoke of receiving information not through words or images, but through direct transfer of understanding. "They've been monitoring our weather systems," she reported, "not to interfere, but to understand how our planet maintains its atmospheric balance. They're concerned about the changes we're creating." The implications of what Elena was experiencing sent chills through me. These weren't random atmospheric anomalies. They were manifestations of an intelligence studying our planet's climate systems, watching how human activity was altering the delicate balance that sustains life. "They want us to know," Elena continued, her voice barely audible through the static. "The weather patterns we've been detecting aren't isolated events. They're part of a larger monitoring network. They've been documenting the acceleration of climate change, the disruption of natural cycles." Around 8:45 a.m., Elena's transmissions stopped entirely. The formation on our radar began to ascend, rising through the atmosphere at the same steady pace it had descended. Within minutes, it had climbed beyond our detection range and disappeared. Marcus and I drove immediately to Elena's last known coordinates. We found her standing in the field, where she'd set up her equipment, completely unharmed, but profoundly changed. Her instruments were still functioning, still recording the lingering electromagnetic signature of what had occurred. Elena couldn't fully articulate what she'd experienced, but she brought back something invaluable. Data. Detailed measurements of atmospheric composition, electromagnetic field fluctuations, and temperature variations that provided our first scientific evidence of these encounters. More importantly, she brought back a message. The atmospheric anomalies we'd been tracking weren't random phenomena. They were part of a systematic study being conducted by an intelligence that understood our planet's climate systems better than we did. "They're trying to help us understand," Elena explained later, reviewing her data. "The formations appear in areas where atmospheric changes are most pronounced. They're mapping the effects of human activity on weather patterns." In the weeks that followed, our Weather Service office became an unofficial research center for these atmospheric anomalies. Elena worked with us to develop new detection methods, ways to identify the formations that didn't rely solely on traditional meteorological equipment. We discovered that the anomalies appeared more frequently during periods of extreme weather events. Major storm systems, unusual temperature fluctuations, and atmospheric river events all seemed to attract their attention. It was as if they were documenting the increasing instability of our climate. The most profound realization came when Elena correlated our anomaly data with global climate change indicators. The formations appeared in precise patterns that mapped directly onto areas of greatest environmental stress. Rising sea temperatures, melting ice sheets, disrupted jet stream patterns, all were being monitored and documented by these atmospheric visitors. "They're not just observing," Elena concluded, after months of analysis. "They're trying to preserve a record of what's happening to our planet, like cosmic climate scientists documenting a planetary transformation." The encounters changed how I understood my work at the Weather Service. We weren't just tracking storms and pressure systems anymore. We were documenting contact with an intelligence that viewed our planet's atmospheric systems as part of a larger, interconnected web of cosmic environmental awareness. Elena left the university and established a private research foundation dedicated to studying these phenomena. She developed protocols for peaceful interaction, methods for sharing our climate data in ways that might be useful to these atmospheric visitors. I still work the overnight shift at the Weather Service, monitoring our skies for signs of unusual activity. The formations continue to appear, always in areas where our planet's atmospheric systems are under stress. Each encounter provides new data, new understanding of how our climate crisis is being observed and documented by intelligences far more advanced than ourselves. The most humbling aspect of these encounters is the realization that we're not alone in our concern for the planet's environmental future. Somewhere in the vast expanse of space, other minds are watching, learning, and perhaps mourning the rapid changes occurring in Earth's delicate atmospheric balance. These atmospheric visitors don't come as conquerors or saviors. They come as witnesses, documenting the transformation of a world whose climate systems are changing faster than its inhabitants can adapt. Their presence serves as both validation of our climate science and a sobering reminder that the changes we're creating extend far beyond our planet's boundaries. Every night, as I monitor the weather patterns across the Rocky Mountain region, I'm aware that we're part of something much larger than local atmospheric conditions. We're participants in a cosmic conversation about planetary health, environmental responsibility, and the delicate balance that sustains life throughout the universe. The formations continue to appear in our skies, silent sentinels documenting the greatest environmental challenge our species has ever faced. Their presence reminds us that the atmosphere we breathe connects us not only to every other living thing on Earth, but to a vast community of intelligences watching our planet's transformation with deep concern and infinite patience. Beneath the ancient Mayan temples, hidden in chambers that have remained sealed for centuries, evidence continues to emerge of what may be humanity's most profound secret. Tonight, we explore encounters that suggest we are not alone, and perhaps never have been. The stories begin in the depths of underground complexes, where researchers have documented unexplained phenomena occurring in perfect synchronization with celestial events. Deep beneath the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, archaeologists discovered a series of chambers containing metallic spheres unlike any known earthly material. These objects, coated in what appears to be powdered gold, emit a faint electromagnetic signature that intensifies during specific astronomical alignments. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a quantum physicist studying these artifacts, reported a disturbing experience while examining the spheres in 2019. She was alone in the underground chamber when the objects began to resonate at a frequency barely audible to human ears. The stone walls themselves seemed to vibrate in response, and the air grew thick with an energy she couldn't identify. As she leaned closer to record the phenomenon, her instruments began malfunctioning. Digital displays flickered, showing impossible readings before going completely dark. What happened next defied explanation. The chamber filled with a soft, pulsing light that seemed to emanate from the spheres themselves. In that luminescence, Dr. Rodriguez saw shapes moving through the walls, translucent figures that appeared to be observing her work. They communicated not through sound, but through direct impression upon her consciousness. The message was clear. The spheres were not artifacts, but active components of a vast underground network that spans the globe. These metallic orbs, she learned, serve as nodes in a communication system established thousands of years ago by visitors who understood that human civilization would eventually develop the technology to detect their presence. The timing of their activation correlates precisely with humanity's advancement into the space age, suggesting a deliberate awakening triggered by our own technological progress. Similar discoveries have emerged from sites across Mesoamerica. Beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent at Teotihuacan, archaeologists found a tunnel system extending far deeper than previously mapped. Robot probes sent into the deepest sections recorded acoustic anomalies consistent with large, hollow spaces filled with air that moves in patterns suggesting active ventilation systems. These chambers, sealed for over a millennium, should contain only stagnant air, yet spectrographic analysis reveals an atmosphere surprisingly rich in oxygen. The implications become more profound when considering the astronomical precision built into these ancient sites. The Mayan calendar, with its sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics, appears to have been designed not merely to track time, but to coordinate with events occurring far beyond our solar system. The calendar's end date of December 21st, 2012, marked not an apocalypse, but a cosmic alignment that activated dormant technologies embedded within sacred sites across the Americas. This activation has triggered a new phase of contact experiences reported by individuals working near these ancient structures. Archaeological teams have documented equipment malfunctions, unexplained electromagnetic fluctuations, and encounters with luminous entities that appear during specific astronomical conditions. These beings, described consistently across multiple witness accounts, stand approximately 8 feet tall and communicate through telepathic transmission of complex mathematical and astronomical data. The information shared during these encounters suggests that the ancient sites were constructed as part of a global network designed to facilitate communication between Earth and distant star systems. The elaborate stone calendars found throughout Mesoamerica function as three-dimensional maps of galactic coordinates, encoding the locations of habitable worlds within a radius of several hundred light-years from Earth. Recent analysis of the Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Mayan books, reveals layers of meaning previously undetected by scholars. When subjected to advanced cryptographic analysis, the text contains embedded sequences that match the mathematical constants describing orbital mechanics of planets in the TRAPPIST-1 system, discovered by modern astronomy only in 2017. The precision of this ancient knowledge suggests access to observational capabilities far beyond what early civilizations could have possessed using available technology. Archaeological expeditions in the remote jungles of Guatemala have uncovered additional evidence of this cosmic connection. Deep within the rainforest, teams have discovered structures that appear to be sophisticated astronomical instruments carved from single blocks of stone with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. These devices, when properly aligned, focus starlight from specific constellations into concentrated beams that activate crystalline components embedded within the stone matrix. The crystalline elements, composed of materials not found naturally on Earth, generate electromagnetic fields that create localized distortions in space-time. Researchers working with these devices report temporal anomalies, clocks running at different rates within the field of influence, and in some cases, brief glimpses of the site as it existed centuries ago, complete with the original inhabitants going about their daily activities. These temporal windows have provided unprecedented insights into the true purpose of the ancient complexes. The sites functioned as multidimensional gateways, allowing consciousness to travel across vast distances instantaneously. The elaborate rituals performed by Mayan priests were not primitive religious ceremonies, but sophisticated technological procedures designed to interface human consciousness with extraterrestrial communication networks. The evidence suggests that select individuals within ancient civilizations served as biological transceivers, their enhanced neural pathways capable of receiving and transmitting information across interstellar distances. These chosen intermediaries, often depicted in ancient art with elongated skulls and enlarged craniums, underwent biological modifications that expanded their cognitive capabilities beyond normal human parameters. Modern encounters near these sites continue to demonstrate the ongoing nature of this cosmic communication network. Individuals with specific genetic markers, particularly those with Native American ancestry linked to the original site builders,
report spontaneous activation of latent psychic abilities when in proximity to the ancient structures. These experiences include precognitive visions of future astronomical events, telepathic communication with non-human intelligences, and in rare cases, temporary displacement to other worlds within the galactic network.
The consistency of these reports across multiple sites and diverse individuals suggests a systematic process of gradual disclosure. As humanity develops the technological sophistication to understand and eventually join the galactic community, dormant systems are awakening to prepare us for that transition. The ancient sites serve as testing grounds, evaluating our readiness to handle knowledge that would fundamentally transform our understanding of our place in the universe. Recent discoveries in the underground chambers beneath Chichen Itza have revealed the most compelling evidence yet of this ongoing contact. Sealed within a chamber that required precisely timed astronomical conditions to access, researchers found a collection of crystalline data storage devices containing information encoded in patterns of light. When interfaced with modern quantum computers, these devices revealed star charts depicting the current positions of previously unknown planetary systems, some showing clear signs of artificial modification consistent with advanced technological civilizations. The data includes detailed biological and genetic information about species inhabiting worlds throughout our local galactic region. Most remarkably, it contains genetic templates that match variants found in human DNA that have long puzzled evolutionary biologists. These sequences, previously considered junk DNA with no apparent function, appear to be dormant code waiting for activation under specific environmental conditions. As our understanding of these ancient mysteries deepens, it becomes increasingly clear that the rise and fall of Mesoamerican civilizations followed a pattern designed to preserve crucial knowledge through periods of cosmic cycles lasting thousands of years. The sudden abandonment of great cities like Teotihuacan and many Mayan centers was not due to warfare or natural disaster, but to the completion of their role as caretakers of technologies that would remain dormant until humanity reached sufficient maturity to inherit them. The evidence continues to accumulate, hidden within stone chambers and encoded in astronomical calculations that speak of a universe far more populated and interconnected than we have dared to imagine. The ancient builders of these magnificent complexes were not primitive peoples struggling to understand their world, but the inheritors of knowledge spanning galaxies, tasked with preserving that wisdom until the time when their descendants would be ready to reclaim their cosmic heritage. I remember the day everything changed. I'd been driving the same route home for 3 years, taking the winding road through the mountains just after midnight. It was quiet that time of night, peaceful even, but peace has a way of shattering when you least expect it. The first sign something was wrong came through the radio. I was listening to a late-night talk show when the signal started cutting in and out, replaced by this strange static that seemed almost rhythmic. Then my headlights began flickering, not like a dying battery, but in perfect sync with the radio interference. That's when I saw them in the distance. 3 lights moving in formation above the tree line, too bright to be aircraft, too coordinated to be natural. They weren't blinking like plane lights. They were steady, pure white, and they moved with a fluidity that defied physics. I pulled over at a scenic overlook, hands trembling as I turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and complete. No insects, no wind, even the distant hum of the highway had vanished. It was as if the world had been placed under a bell jar. The lights descended slowly, methodically, until they hovered maybe 50 feet above the road. That's when I noticed my watch had stopped. The digital clock on my dashboard was frozen too. Time itself seemed suspended in that moment. One of the lights broke formation and drifted toward my car. As it approached, I could see it wasn't just light, but some kind of craft, smooth and seamless, without any visible means of propulsion. The air around it shimmered like heat waves, though the night was cool. Then came the sound, not mechanical, but almost musical, a low harmonic vibration that I felt in my chest rather than heard with my ears. It resonated through the car, through my bones, creating a strange sense of calm, despite the impossibility of what I was witnessing. The craft hovered directly above me for what felt like hours, but could have been minutes. I found myself unable to move, not from fear, but from a curious paralysis, as if my body was no longer entirely under my control. Images flashed through my mind, not my own memories, but something else entirely. Vast star systems, ancient civilizations, technology beyond human comprehension. It was knowledge being shared, information flowing into my consciousness like water into a sponge. When the visions ended, the craft began to rise, rejoining its companions in their perfect formation. They accelerated silently into the night sky, becoming pinpricks of light before vanishing entirely among the stars. My watch started ticking again. The dashboard clock resumed its digital march through time. The radio crackled back to life, picking up the talk show mid-sentence as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. As I drove home in the early morning light, I carried with me the profound understanding that we are not alone in this universe, that somewhere among the countless stars, intelligence far greater than our own continues its ancient journey through the cosmos. I've never spoken of that night to anyone. How could I explain something that exists beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience? Yet sometimes, when I look up at the night sky, I sense them still out there, watching, waiting, perhaps preparing for a time when humanity is ready for the next chapter in our cosmic story. The knowledge they shared remains with me, a gift and a burden, reminding me that the universe is far stranger and more wonderful than we dare imagine. In those quiet moments before sleep, I find myself grateful for that encounter, for the glimpse it provided into the magnificent mystery that surrounds us all. And perhaps, in sharing this with you now, in these final moments before dawn, that knowledge begins its journey into other minds, other hearts, carrying forward the truth that was given to me on that impossible night when the stars came down to earth. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the vastness above, ancient travelers continue their eternal watch over our small blue world. As the night deepened around us, we found ourselves questioning everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe. The encounters we've shared tonight paint a picture of a reality far stranger and more interconnected than most dare to imagine. From the synchronized patterns emerging in remote wilderness areas to the deliberate communication attempts captured by unsuspecting witnesses, each story adds another piece to an increasingly complex puzzle. What becomes clear through these accounts is that we are not dealing with random phenomena or isolated incidents. The careful timing, the precise electromagnetic signatures, the deliberate placement near natural energy nodes and ancient sites all point to something far more systematic. These beings, whatever their origin, appear to be conducting an ongoing study of our planet and its inhabitants with scientific precision that spans decades, perhaps centuries. The recurring themes throughout tonight's stories reveal a pattern of behavior that suggests deep intelligence and purpose. The way these entities seem drawn to areas of geological significance, their apparent interest in monitoring our technological development, and their consistent avoidance of direct confrontation all indicate a sophisticated understanding of both our capabilities and our limitations. Perhaps most intriguing is the evidence of their connection to Earth's natural systems. The correlation between sightings and electromagnetic anomalies, the frequent appearances near water sources and mountain ranges, the way animals react with instinctive recognition rather than fear, all suggest these visitors have a profound understanding of our planet's fundamental energies. They move through our world not as invaders, but as researchers who have perhaps been here far longer than we realize. The witness accounts consistently describe technology that operates beyond our current understanding of physics. Silent propulsion systems, instantaneous acceleration, the ability to manipulate electromagnetic fields, and even time itself. Yet rather than demonstrations of power, these displays seem more like glimpses of possibilities, as if we're being gradually prepared for concepts our science has yet to embrace. What's particularly striking is how these encounters often leave witnesses changed, not traumatized, but awakened to possibilities they had never considered. The common thread of enhanced intuition, heightened awareness of natural phenomena, and a deeper sense of connection to something greater suggests these interactions may be intentionally transformative. The locations themselves tell a story. Remote forests where ancient trees have stood sentinel for centuries, mountain peaks that have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, desert landscapes unmarked by human influence, coastal areas where the boundary between earth and sea creates natural energy vortexes. These beings seem drawn to places where the veil between dimensions grows thin, where the planet's natural power flows most freely. As we consider the implications of these ongoing encounters, we must acknowledge that we may be witnessing the next phase of a relationship that has existed far longer than recorded history. The evidence suggests not invasion, but integration, not conquest, but collaboration. Perhaps these entities have been quietly guiding our development, waiting for us to reach a level of consciousness where open contact becomes possible. The electromagnetic disturbances, the time anomalies, the precisely timed appearances, all point to a technology that operates on principles we're only beginning to understand. Quantum mechanics, dimensional theory, consciousness-matter interaction, these emerging fields of science may finally be catching up to phenomena that have been occurring around us all along. Tonight's accounts remind us that we live in a universe far more mysterious and interconnected than our daily lives would suggest. The boundaries between the known and unknown are not as fixed as we once believed. Every clear night, sky holds infinite possibilities. Every unexplored wilderness may harbor secrets that could reshape our understanding of reality itself. The witnesses who shared their stories tonight are not seekers of attention or believers in fantasies. They are ordinary people who found themselves experiencing the extraordinary. Their courage in speaking truth to skepticism helps illuminate a reality that demands our attention and respect. As we drift towards sleep, consider that somewhere above us, in the vast darkness between stars, intelligences far older and wiser than ourselves continue their patient observation. They have watched civilizations rise and fall, have seen species evolve and transcend their origins. Perhaps they wait for us to join them in that greater community of consciousness that spans the cosmos. The encounters continue, the evidence accumulates, the truth slowly emerges from the shadows of secrecy and denial. We stand at the threshold of revelations that will transform not just our science and technology, but our very understanding of what it means to be human in an infinite universe filled with intelligence and purpose. Rest well, knowing that we are not alone, and that the watchers in the darkness come not as harbingers of fear, but as guardians of a cosmic awakening that has already begun. These encounters and observations suggest something profound and ongoing. The patterns emerge not just from remote locations or ancient sites, but from the very fabric of our everyday experiences. The beings and phenomena described, whether appearing as lights, geometric patterns, or translucent forms, seem to operate with an intelligence that transcends our current understanding of physics and consciousness. What strikes me most deeply about these accounts is their consistency across vastly different environments and circumstances. From the desert highways to forest clearings, from lake shores to urban neighborhoods, there's a thread connecting these experiences that speaks to something larger than isolated incidents. These aren't random encounters, but part of a systematic presence that has been documenting, studying, and perhaps guiding our world for far longer than we've been aware. The technological signatures, The way electronics fail, compasses spin, and time distorts point to an intelligence operating with principles we're only beginning to glimpse. Yet there's something almost gentle about many of these interactions, as if whatever is observing us understands the delicate nature of contact and revelation. Perhaps most intriguing is how these phenomena seem drawn to moments of transition and change, appearing at the edges of our perception when we're alone with our thoughts, walking trails we know by heart, or simply going about our quiet routines. They emerge from the spaces between our certainties, reminding us that consciousness and intelligence take forms we're still learning to recognize. These accounts aren't just stories of strange lights or unexplained objects. They're glimpses into a larger reality, where Earth serves as both classroom and laboratory for intelligences that have been present throughout our development. The geometric patterns in ancient sites, the precision of celestial knowledge among early civilizations, and the ongoing subtle interventions in our modern world all point to a continuous relationship, one that's been quietly shaping our understanding of ourselves and our place in a universe far more populated and intentional than we've dared to imagine. As you drift towards sleep, remember that you're part of this vast, interconnected story. The same cosmos that has watched over humanity for millennia continues its silent vigil, offering glimpses of greater truths to those ready to perceive them. Rest well, knowing that consciousness extends far beyond our small world, and that we're never truly alone in the infinite expanse of existence.